Okay, hello everyone. Oh, sounded husky there. Hello everyone. Welcome to Unit 1, Part 2 Notes, which is about sovereignty, authority, and power in political systems. And at the end, it gets to different types of regimes, which you're then going to do the regime assignment about. So hopefully you have your notebook out, or you've made a copy of the slideshow where you're going to take notes in the speaker notes, or you're going to save this slideshow as a PDF and annotate it in DocHub or Google Read and Write, which are two Chrome extensions where you can do online annotating. If you have any questions about how to best take notes, please don't hesitate to email me or ask me in class. Okay, so let's move on. So the definition of power, which we kind of touched on in the first part of the notes, is Party A's ability to get Party B to do something it may not do otherwise. So you can use coercion or force to get people to do something. You could try to use your powers of persuasion verbally, or you could offer incentives like you do with toddlers. Like, hey, Finn, if you put your shoes on, maybe I'll let you hop to the car like a bunny. Right? Authority is a little different from power. It is the legal right to use power. So, like the like the military, right, has the legal right to use power. Police have the legal right to use power. Politicians have the legal right to use power. And sovereignty. So sovereignty is basically the legal right and ability of a state to carry out its actions and policies within its territory. So I always like to highlight this word reign in here. So to reign means to rule. So to be sovereign means you're independent and can rule over yourself. And I always use the example of Family Guy. It's a old, a animated show. It's been on for a long time. I remember watching it when I was in college. And I started college in 2004. So in this episode of Family Guy, Peter, one of the main characters, starts his own country of Pretoria. And in that country, he proclaims himself a sovereign nation separate from the United States of America. And then he, claims that he has the authority or the legal right to annex his friend Joe's pool and call it Joe-Hio. So what is stopping other people from just starting their own nations? Well, in order to be a sovereign nation, many people have to recognize that your country is independent. And so nobody recognized that Pretoria was an independent country, hence it wasn't a country. There are some countries in the world where the sovereignty of the countries is in question. There's about 205 states in the world. State is another word for country, which I'll get to in a little bit. And it's confusing because the United States calls, we have states like Illinois and Indiana, but actually state means country internationally. That's why we have a Secretary of State, right? Although that can be confusing too, because we also have a Secretary of State in the state of Illinois, right? Jesse White, who does the DMV. But the Secretary of State, when I refer to it in this class, I'll be talking about the Secretary of State of the entire country. So getting back to sovereignty, 205 countries in the world, and some of those countries, not everyone recognizes them as independent countries, like Palestine. Not everyone recognizes Palestine as its own country. Some people think that it is a region in Israel. Same thing with Taiwan. Taiwan thinks it's an independent country, but China thinks it's part of Taiwan. We'll get to that more later when we learn about China. All right, moving on to legitimacy. So legitimacy is the right to rule, right, as determined by citizens. So legitimacy, when something is legitimate, it means people believe in it, they trust it. They may not necessarily like it, but they believe in it, trust it, and obey it. So the right to rule. There's three different types of legitimacy: traditional, charismatic, and rational legal. So traditional is basically past traditions determine who should rule and how. This would be like in England, they have a queen, right? In the United Kingdom, they have a queen, and it's tradition that the throne gets passed down in that family. Charismatic, that's another way that a government can achieve legitimacy. So if you have a very dynamic personality, then and you lead the country and people like it, then that might be an example of charismatic legitimacy. So when I think of charismatic legitimacy, I think of people like Adolf Hitler. Ooh, I'm going to sneeze. Held it in. I think of people like Adolf Hitler. I think of people like Vladimir Putin. I think of people like, let's see, who else was very charismatic? Barack Obama, Donald Trump. Let's see, what other leaders? Vicente Fox of Mexico, people who like are extremely like they're good talkers, and they can kind of hold a crowd. So that would be charismatic legitimacy. And then rational legal, this is based on well-established laws and procedures. So rational legal legitimacy is when your government's legitimacy comes, from laws. So common law and code law are two different types of laws. Common law is what is started in the United Kingdom, and common law is not necessarily based on laws that a legislature makes, because when you think about who makes laws, it's the legislative branch, right? They pass the laws and then they're written down. So common law is like court case precedents. So when a court case happens and is decided, that would be an example of common law. And then also any kind of oral traditions. So common law is like court case precedents and oral traditions, not necessarily laws created by the legislature. And code law is laws that are written down that are created by a legislative branch. So when we're talking about legitimate governments, people accept the authority of the leaders. Other countries recognize that that regime has the right to rule. So this can happen in authoritarian governments, right? Even though authoritarian governments, there's not a lot of power to the people. Some people, really respect the government still, like in Russia and China. Those are authoritarian governments, but the governments have high levels of legitimacy. If you want more clarification on traditional, charismatic, and rational, you can look in the speaker notes. Okay, so besides traditional, charismatic, and rational legal legitimacy, governments can get legitimacy from other sources. So remember, legitimacy is basically you respect the government's right to rule. Okay, so things that help governments achieve legitimacy would be if the economy is doing well, a sense of nationalism or pride in your nation, a shared political culture / political ideology. Don't worry if you don't know what those things are, we'll get to them. Shared religion, and satisfaction with the government's performance and responsiveness to the people. So these are all things that can encourage a government to be legitimate. Okay, buckle up, because I'm about to do the difference between states, nations, and regimes. And this can be kind of confusing. Remember, I can clarify any of this for you on Friday. That's the reason why I'm recording these and having you look at them beforehand, because then the next day, the next class period you'll have opportunities to talk about what you learned with your classmates and then ask any questions of me. So I think it will be really good. Okay, so there is a difference between a state, a nation, and regime, and you probably have been using them interchangeably. I know when I teach U.S. government, I use them interchangeably, but in comparative government, we have to be careful because they mean different things. So a state is a political system that has sovereignty exercised over a population in a defined geographic territory through a set of public institutions. What are institutions? Executives, legislatures, judiciaries, and the bureaucracy. What's a bureaucracy? A bureaucracy are people that carry out laws. A bureaucracy is a part of the executive branch. And then whenever the legislative branch makes laws, the bureaucracy carries out those laws. This would be like the post office, the Social Security office, Department of Health and Human Services, things like that. A state also establishes and maintains armed forces, and another definition of a state is a state has a monopoly on forced violence in a designated area. So what that means is that if you have a state, that means that whoever is in charge of the state is also in charge on who gets to use force and violence in an area. So basically how I remember a state is an acronym called STPG, See the People Grow. So I'll put that in the speaker notes. See the people grow. To be a state, you have to have sovereignty, territory, population, and government. If you're missing any one of these things, you can't be a state. So typically, what you've been referring to as a country your entire life is actually a state. So the state of the United Kingdom, the state of the United States of America, the state of Mexico, the state of China. So actually, if we're going to be correct in our political science terminology, we should be calling countries states, right? And if you need more clarification, there's some other stuff in the speaker notes. So what's a nation then? A nation sometimes overlaps with a state, sometimes doesn't. A nation is a human community with a shared history, culture, and or political identity. Nationalism often is what binds nations together, a shared sense of pride and something about your nation. And then typically nations share ethnic identities. So nations sometimes are larger than states. Nations can be divided into two, and there are nations that don't have states, right? So I'll talk about those. So in the United States of America, we are a multi-nation state. Why? Because we have many different groups of people in this country, and those groups of people are their own nations, right? We have, so you might identify a nation by race. You might identify a nation by religion, right? Catholics, Jews, Protestants. You might identify a nation by ethnicity, Jewish, Polish, German. You might identify a nation by the language they speak, English, Spanish, right? So the United States of America we have many nations. We're a multi-nation state. Nations can sometimes be larger than states. For instance, Germany is a state, right? But there are Germans in Austria, Switzerland, and the Netherlands. So the German nation extends beyond the state of Germany. There are nations divided into two, right? The Korean people share many similarities, but they're located in two states, North Korea and South Korea. And there can also be nations without states. So, for instance, Palestine. That is a nation of people, primarily Muslim, who share many other characteristics, right? But they don't have a state because their state is in dispute, right? Many people in Palestine think that they're a separate state, but Israel currently claims Palestine as a region. Also, terrorist groups are usually nations without states. They have territory, right? They have population. They may have a government, but they don't have sovereignty. They're not independent. So ISIS would be an example of a nation without a state. Same thing, any kind of terrorist group, Al-Qaeda, before Al-Qaeda kind of got absorbed into ISIS. And then there are other examples listed in the speaker notes. So a state is like the political boundaries, and nation is more of the cultural boundaries. And then we have a regime. So a regime is probably what you thought was a government. So kind of like you thought you probably thought a state was a country. You probably thought a regime was a government. So you might be wondering, what about the word country? I didn't include the definition of country in here because it's not really part of political science terminology, but a country can refer to the geographic borders. Like the United States of America, we have geographic borders. We have, on a map, right, we have boundaries. We have natural geographic borders like the Atlantic and Pacific Ocean and mountain ranges, things like that. So that would be a country. It would be the geographic boundaries. So, okay, hopefully you understand the difference between a state, nation, and regime. And if you don't, we can definitely clarify on Friday. Okay, so what's a regime? A regime is a political system of a state, okay? So the rules that states set and follow in exerting power over time, and these regimes endure beyond individual governments or leaders. So a regime would be democracy. A regime would be authoritarianism. A regime would be totalitarianism, militarism. These are the rules of a political system of a state. The government is the group of people that work to uphold the rules of the regime. So governments are interchangeable, right? They're elected, they're chosen, they go in and out. The regime stays usually, unless there's a revolution or a coup. But the government changes depending on elections. Okay, so here's a metaphor to help you understand the difference between regime and government. The state is the machine, and the regime is the programming, right? And the government is the operator of the machine. So the state's the machine, the regime is the programming of the machine, and the government is the operator of the machine. All right, moving along. Here's a visual for my visual people. So the government operates the regime is part of the state, the country is the geographic borders. Okay, now we're moving into the types of regimes. There's, I think, 6 types of regimes we'll study in this country, There's 6 types of regimes that we'll study in this class. And make sure that you pay close attention to this, because in the regime assignment, I'm going to ask you to make a model of each regime. That's going to be fun. What we used to do when in person is I would get a 7-pound bag of gummy bears, and you'd be in groups, and you would make gummy bear models of each regime. But obviously I can't do that now because we're not in person, and I can't have people touching a bunch of gummy bears. That seems like a recipe for illness. Okay, so the first type of regime is democracy. Okay, so I'm actually going to skip, well, no, maybe I won't. I'll just skip that slide. Okay, so democracy. Democracy, power to the people, right, comes from ancient Greece. In this class, we're going to talk about 2 different types of democracies, a liberal substantive democracy and an illiberal procedural democracy. So these are synonymous, liberal substantive, illiberal procedural. So a liberal substantive democracy is the real deal democracy. It walks the walk, and it talks the talk, and it walks the walk. Okay? So to be a liberal substantive democracy, you have to have competitive elections, civil liberties, which are individual freedoms, rule of law, a neutral judiciary that can rule on things independently, an open civil society. Civil society is life outside of the government, and civilian control of the military. So to be a substantive liberal democracy, you have to have not only the tenets of a democracy, but you have to actually practice them. An illiberal or procedural democracy looks like a democracy, but it may not have many of the features listed above. So Russia is an example of an illiberal procedural democracy. It has some of the procedures like an election, but it's not competitive, right, if Putin's the only one running. It has a judiciary, but it's not neutral, right? Civil society isn't open. So that's a difference between liberal and illiberal democracy. And if you want more clarification, there's some other stuff in the speaker notes. So that's democracy. 2 types, liberal and illiberal. Then we have authoritarianism. You probably already know about this. Authoritarianism is when a small group of individuals or one person exercises power over the state. Okay? So in this class, Russia is also authoritarian. They're a hybrid regime. Hybrid regime means they're a mix of 2 regimes. So, and also China would be an example of an authoritarian country that we study in this class, and also Iran is an example. More characteristics of an authoritarian regime. The 2 main regimes we study in this class are democracy and authoritarian. So in an authoritarian regime, you have elites who hold political power and make decisions. Some authoritarian regimes are communist, and some are corporatist. Don't worry about the definition you don't need to worry about these 2 definitions right now, because we'll get to those when we study corporatist countries. In an authoritarian regime, the economy is usually controlled. Citizens don't really have much input on selection of leaders, and there's not very many individual freedoms. So those are characteristics of an authoritarian regime, just like we did characteristics of a democracy. Okay, so you're probably wondering how authoritarian regime is different from a totalitarian regime. Well, totalitarian is like the next step up in control from an authoritarian regime. So totalitarian has the word total, right? So in a totalitarian regime, you have total control. That means that it's extremely possessive or repressive. That means in a totalitarian regime, they try to control not only what you do, but how you act, what you wear, all that different stuff. And they use violence and terror in which to accomplish that. So Hitler's Nazi Germany would be an example of a totalitarian regime, Stalin's Soviet Union, Mussolini's Italy, and a modern day example would be North Korea. So totalitarian regimes, total control, try to control your thoughts, your dress, basically all outward expressions of life. That's how it's different from authoritarian. Authoritarian is not total control. It's just a lot of government control of things, but they're not trying to control necessarily what you dress, how you dress, and what you're thinking about. And they don't always use violence and terror in an authoritarian regime. Okay, another type of regime we study is a military regime. Military regimes are obviously not democratic. It's where the military is in charge and makes all the decisions. Military regimes are prevalent in Latin America, Africa, and parts of Asia. Usually begins with a coup where the military takes over the government. And an example that we study in this country, or in this class, sorry, I keep saying country instead of class, is Nigeria. Nigeria used to have a military regime. They don't anymore. They are now they're a new democracy, right? Probably illiberal, because they haven't been a democracy long enough. They're not an advanced consolidated democracy. But military rule is common in states that struggle with legitimacy, or states that have just had a revolution, or where there's a lot of public unrest or violence. So what's a coup? A coup is when a group of people or one person tries to take over, tries to kick out the people in power. Okay? So a coup is where you try to change governments. And remember, a government is the people, not the regime, right? When you're trying to change the regime, that's a revolution, which don't worry about that right now. We'll talk about that on a later day. Okay, so theocracy. A theocracy is a political system where religious leaders control political decisions, and religious law, like the Bible or the Quran, provides the basis for policy decisions. So there's only one state in the world that's a full theocracy, and that's Iran. And we do study Iran in this class. So those are the different types of regimes we'll study: democracy, authoritarian, totalitarian, military, and theocracy. So I guess that's 5 regimes, but since there's 2 different types of democracies, 6. Okay, so now you can go into Schoology and look at the regime assignment and start working on it.